still working on Chapter 4, the problem 1A, and we are going to do Part 3. And Part 3 is asking us to prepare the closing entries based on the information above. Now we prepared, in the first part, we prepared the income statement. Then we prepared the retained earnings and the balance sheet. So we've done that in part 1 and 2. Now we're going to be closing the revenue accounts. Then we'll close the expense accounts. After that, we'll take the net income or loss, in this case we had income, closing that to retained earnings, and we will close the dividend to retained earnings. So we're going to start listing our accounts, and the first one's going to be my fees earned, because I need to debit that, right? It has a credit balance, I've got to debit it, and that's $368,100. I'm referring to the trial balance up above. And then I have my rent revenue. I need to debit it for $1,000. And I'm going to credit my income summary for the total amount. That's $1,000. The total of this is $369,100. So that would be my entry for the closing the revenue accounts. Then I need to close my expense accounts, and I'll do that in order. The first one is salaries and wages, or I'm sorry, I'm going to debit my income summary for the total of all my expenses. I can go up to my income statement, and that was $221,300. So I'm going to enter that down here. $221,300. My first expense account I need to credit was salaries and wages for $164,900. My next expense account was advertising. I'm going to credit that for $21,700. My next expense account, utilities, and I'll be crediting that to $11,400. So I'm bringing each one of my expense accounts now to zero, and that's the purpose of what I'm doing. Repairs on line 28 is $88.50. Then I have depreciation expense on the equipment. I'm going to credit that for $4,200. Insurance expense is going to be credited for $2,500. Supplies expense, I'll credit that for $18.30. That's from line 31. $18.30. My depreciation expense on the building, that's going to be $1,600. And my miscellaneous expense, credit that for $43.20. So I'm going to do those. Now I'm going to do the third step in the closing entries, and that's to take the net income and close it to my retained earnings. So I'm going to debit my income summary for the amount of the net income, and remember the net income, we can pull that from a couple places, was $147,800. I'm going to credit my retained earnings for the same amount, and then finally I'm going to close my dividends, so I'll debit my retained earnings. I believe the dividends were $10,000. Double check. Yes. And I'll credit my dividends account, bringing it to zero. Finally, in this last portion of this problem, it's asking us to prepare a post-closing trial balance. List all the accounts, the assets, liabilities, cash, dividends, revenue, expenses. If the box does not require an entry, leave it blank. The closing entry has taken all the revenue accounts and the expense accounts and dividends and made those zero. So none of those will be entered. So what we would do, we're going to enter our cash. And cash would have a debit balance of $10,800. Our accounts receivable is next, line 9. And that is going to be $43,300. My prepaid insurance is next. That would be $1,700. And then we'll have supplies. $900. Land. $98,000. My building. $400,000. Accumulated depreciation on the building has a credit of $206,900. We have our equipment next, and the equipment was $101,000. We have accumulated depreciation on that equipment. Oops, I grabbed the wrong, not expense, but accumulated depreciation is what I want. And that is $89,300. Next, our accounts payable. It has a credit balance of $15,700. Our salaries and wages payable. Salaries and wages payable is $1,800. Unearned rent is $1,100. Our capital stock, and that doesn't change. That's still going to be $75,000. And we're going to be putting our retained earnings in, and the retained earnings we have is $265,900. And so, and then we would finally enter the totals for those. I'm not going to bother. We can add those some other day. I have an error there. That should be 75,000. Typo. So, in this problem, I have selected this because it's very similar to the homework that I've assigned to you folks, and you will be able to follow that for purposes of completing your homework.